Hey, everyone out there. You guys are having a great day. If any of you are just logging in, we've got some photos going for you. We're going to start here in a few minutes. Right now in California, it's about 4:28. So we'll give time for people to log in. While you guys are checking in with us, we've got some photos of the winery, and we've got some photos of Silverado Cooking School. We're lucky today. We have a great friend of ours, Malcom to Sieyes, here to talk about cooking with wine. And that you heard him speaking there. So just get yourself settled in. Make sure you guys have a glass of wine. Whatever you guys want to drink is perfectly great for today. It's going to be a fun, casual evening of chatting food and wine, which is something we all love. So there's some pictures from Harvest. So not all of you, I understand that not all of you can see pictures. We have a scrolling series of pictures going through right now, but for some reason, some mechanisms don't allow pictures to go through. So if you don't see pictures, sorry, you just get us. But for those of you who can see the pictures, I hope you guys are enjoying. And we'll be starting here in a couple minutes. So settle in, get your wine, get your dinners in front of you if you guys are having a little dinner with us tonight. And we'll be starting in a little bit. I've got Chardonnay. What are you drinking, Jeff?
Rosé and Zin.
Rosé and Zin. Wow.
Yeah.
Malcom,
And Chardonnay. I'll drink Chardonnay too.
Are you drinking it?
Okay. I've got the Chardonnay.
Well, cheers.
Yeah. These pictures are hilarious.
So if you guys are joining us now, there's pictures scrolling through for some of you, hopefully most of you. I understand not everyone can necessarily see the pictures based on their own home technological setup, but we have pictures from Silverado Cooking School when our Fontanella winery staff have had some company parties there. And you'll see Malcom in some of the pictures, who's our guest chef today, and then some pictures of us at the winery as well. So we're gonna get rolling here in just a little bit. Hope you guys are all getting settled in. Do you guys all have wine? You have wine? Malcom has wine.
Check.
Malcom, was Kim gonna join us from home?
I think so. Yeah, Kim is my wife. Yeah.
All right, well, wife Kim is a fan of our Chardonnay, so I know that if she's at home watching, she has Chardonnay. And I'm sure she's laughing right now knowing that we're talking about her.
Great.
All right, so it's 4:30. I'm gonna go ahead and get us rolling here. So hopefully we've got a good group of people that have joined us. So hope you guys enjoyed some pictures if you guys were able to see it. And looks like people are joining us as we go along. So welcome everyone. I'm Karen Fontanella, and this is my husband, Jeff Fontanella.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Hope you're all doing well.
We are in quarantine time and at home. I know not everyone across the United States is as locked in as we are here in California, but we still have shelter in place here. And thought a night of enjoying some wines with all of you would be a fun way for us to spend our Friday evening. So we're glad that you all joined us. We've got people here from the Fontanella Wine Club. We've got people from Silverado Cooking School who have joined us as well that might be new to Fontanella. So thank you for joining us. And we've got a lot of friends from Facebook that have come on as well. So we're excited to have all of you guys out here and hope you guys enjoy chatting with us a little bit about food and wine. So a couple things to keep in mind. This is actually our third webinar, so I think we're getting a little bit more practiced at what we're doing. But this is a webinar, so you can see us and hear us, but we can't see or hear you. That being said, we still like to interact with you, and the best way to do that is by asking us questions through the question and answer feature on Zoom. So if you look down below, you'll see Q&A down there. And in the Q&A, you can ask questions, but in addition to that, you can also, I don't know, tell us where you're from, like make comments, let us know how things are going where you're at. we sit here and read them while we're talking. And so, so we love having you guys chime in and let us know where you're coming from. I see we've got people from Texas and Iowa, New Jersey.
All right.
Longview, Texas. Oh, this is great. So, so let us know where you're coming in from. Chicago. I know we've got a fan base in Cedar Rapids. So hi, all of you for 70 Winehouse and everyone out in Iowa. Anyways, so let us know where you're from and make sure you ask questions. It's best for Jeff and Malcolm and I if we can answer your questions and interact with you. So use that feature. So happy hour means wine. I hope you guys all have a glass of wine in front of you. I know we do. And so cheers, everyone. It doesn't matter what you're drinking. We're going to be talking just about cooking with wine in general. So we're going to go through a lot of our Fontanella lineup. And so open what you have, open what you want, and just, you know, sit back and enjoy at the end of the day. So I want to first welcome our really, really dear friend, Malcom to Sieyes. Malcom we've known for a number of years. And Malcom is a local chef here in Napa. He owns the Silverado Cooking School here in Napa Valley. And the school is a wonderful place for people to go and take classes on cooking, like whether you're like a home chef like me, or you're an aspiring chef. There's all sorts of courses that they offer. One of the great things that we love about it is they allow us to have private parties there. So we've had a number of our Fontanella parties, holiday parties at Malcom's Cooking School. So it's been super great. It's one of the gems of Napa Valley, and so we're so lucky to have Malcom here. And so not only is Malcom a chef, but he also owns a farm called Stone Tree Farm. And that's where he grows all of the organic fruits and vegetables and things that he uses at the cooking school when he's cooking. And also that's where his family lives as well. He's got a wife and 2 amazing kids. And they're just a wonderful friends and great people to have in the Valley with us. So, so he's a farmer, he's a chef, he's a sommelier as well. And so he's just perfectly aligned to kind of talk about food and wine, pairing food and wine, cooking with food, and well, obviously cooking with food, but cooking with wine in your food. And so I think that kind of sums up Malcom. So please welcome Malcom, and we're going to start talking about food and wine.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, very fun to be here.
Awesome. So we thought we'd start with maybe talking a little bit about the whites and what, you know, or I don't know, do you want to start talking first about like cooking with wine in general? Is that the best way to start, Malcom?
Sure, yeah. I think, you know, you can cook with wine in a lot of different ways. People marinate their food in wine. They deglaze their pan when they're making pan sauces or going to make a reduction. They use it in braising. And so the recipes I'm going to give you are 2 braising dishes. Even though it's getting warmer, they're still kind of comfort food. And I think now people are using, you know, food as a form of comfort at home, especially cooking and eating together. And you know, we're not allowed to leave. I came down to my place of business because I'm not conducting business, but I'm here at the kitchen, just kind of being here and being in a commercial kitchen setting. But when we're cooking with wine, we want to kind of approach it in the same way that you would pair wine with food, because you want to make sure you're using the correct wine in the correct dish. So there's a couple different ways that you can approach it. Usually when you think of kind of lighter, you know, dishes, whether it's a lighter protein like chicken or fish, you would be using a lighter bodied wine. That's not always the case, but that's kind of the rule, where if you're thinking about food and wine pairings, it kind of lends itself to cooking with it in the food. It's also something that, other than a marinade, you almost always cook the alcohol portion of the wine and a lot of the water that's in the wine out before you actually finish the dish, because the alcohol in the food usually tends to clash with the flavor profile, and it actually becomes, on the palate, not as pleasant as if you're actually drinking it in your glass. So I'll kind of go over some recipes that we're going to send to those of you that would like it. And we can definitely talk about, you know, different styles of wine in different dishes. So Karen, do you have anything you want to talk about, or do you want me to keep going?
Well, I think one of the things that like I always wonder is when I'm cooking with wine is like, and maybe you covered this quickly, but like my kids are like, oh, I can't have that. You put wine in it. So what happens when, you know, when you cook with wine? Is there still alcohol in it when you're done, or does it depend?
Yeah. So, you know, if you're cooking a dish, so say like coq au vin is like a very classic French dish, and you cook it in a lot of red wine. But it's also braised for a long time. So a braised dish is something that a lot of people would commonly refer to as like a pot roast, where you're actually using a large vessel that can contain the ingredients, but also has a very tight fitting lid so it can go from the stovetop to the oven. If you're using a lot of wine in a recipe and you're cooking in the oven, one of the first things to evaporate is going to be the alcohol. But if you have not reduced almost all the liquid out to almost like a glaze, a very thick syrupy consistency, then you're still going to have a little bit of alcohol that's residual in the dish, but it's going to be like a very minute amount, almost the same as what would be like in a kombucha tea. And so it's really a negligible amount, but also people that have, you know, and I think most of us that are sitting here drinking wine are not in that camp, but people who don't drink usually are the people who don't want to be putting that into the ingredients in their food. With that being said, it really is something that will not have any type of intoxicating effect at all because it's going to be cooked out of the dish. And the braising recipes are cooked until you reduce it almost completely away to the point where it's almost a dry pan. And in that respect, there is no alcohol that's actually left in the dish.
Cool. I've always wanted to do that. All right, so let's talk in particular maybe about well, I'm drinking some Chardonnay. So what, like, to me, like that's, if I'm ever gonna cook with white wine, I feel like the first white wine that I always go to is Chardonnay to throw into a dish. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so you have a really awesome, like very, very well-balanced Chardonnay. If you're somebody that likes the richer style Chardonnay, where it's just like almost like people refer to as like a meal in a glass, very oaky, very buttery, then it's something that sometimes can dominate a dish, and it's not usually something you want to cook with. And also, one big misconception is that you want to use bad wine to cook with. It's kind of like using bad ingredients in your dish. It's just going to turn out badly. So you want to have a nice wine, and you're not using usually a lot of it. I mean, sometimes if you're cooking for 10 people, it's a cup and a half. But you know, if you're cooking with a wine, you want to make sure it's something that you would drink. Now, that being said, if you have, you know, a bottle of wine that say, oh, has been on your counter for, you know, I can't let these, you know, actually sit around very long because they tend to drink themselves. But, you know, if it's the type of wine that you're like, oh, I still have, you know, a glass left in there, but it's been on my counter for like 4 or 5 days, I don't really want to drink it. If you cork it really well and put it in the fridge, then it's totally fine to use, you know, a couple weeks later. Because you're going to be actually cooking it, reducing it, you're getting the essence of the wine and not, you know, you're not drinking it. So the oxidation is not really an issue. But, you know, it's, if you're doing, say, something like a Chardonnay, the recipe that I'm going to give you is for chicken. And so it would be a perfect wine that you could use in that dish. And it also would pair well with the meal. So it's nice because by extension, the ingredient is in the dish, but then you're cooking with it and you're also drinking it. And so it pairs very nicely with it. There's a lot of other super classic dishes like, you know, mussels that are cooked in white wine and other things that need kind of a light, delicate, you know, type of wine. And that's definitely the structure of, say, that this, you know, Chardonnay or, you know, kind of a lighter, more dry style. You want to kind of stay away from, unless you're doing a dish that's actually a sweet preparation, from having something that has a lot of residual sugar. So if you had, you know, a Riesling that is really, really, you know, high in residual sugar, you probably wouldn't want to use that in a dish like, you know, say the chicken dish or something else that's savory.
So can we maybe Jeff, you could like talk a little bit about like when you're making wine, like the decision process and like residual sugar and how would you have residual sugar left over in a wine when you're making it?
Okay, so with all of our table wines, we don't have any significant residual sugar. We do have a dessert wine which has a significant amount of residual sugar, but our Cabernet, our Zinfandel, our Chardonnay, we're traditionally fermenting these. The yeast are consuming all of the available sugar. There might be a trace amount of sugar left, but in terms of the spectrum of what would be considered sweet or slightly off dry, we're nowhere near that. We are dry wines on the Chard, the Zin, the Cabernet, you know, our special wine club wines, the Santo, the Cab Francs, those things as well. when we make port, a port style wine, we're not in Portugal, so we don't actually make port, but we make a fortified wine, and that has a significant amount of sugar. So there's not too much to worry about using, residual sugar wise with these style of wines. Typically Napa wines aren't showing some RS. Riesling is one that tends to have some RS. German Rieslings have varying degrees of a lot of residual sugar, and that's been a stylistic classification system that's been evolved over many years in Germany. But I mean, as far as pulling sugar out of these, I'm not sure what the rules are for cooking, but generally I'm kind of thinking about the acid more than sugar when I'm cooking proteins and things. And if I need to brighten the chicken and whatnot, I'm looking more at the acidity and the fruit profile rather than the sweetness that I'm trying to contribute. But I shouldn't be speaking to those to those things. That's more Malcolm's department.
No, that's totally great. I mean, and that's kind of a good bridge, is that what makes a good food-friendly wine is, and what you're speaking to, is just acid that carries the flavor. So, in food, we think about, acidity. We also think about, using sodium in the form of salt in order to, season a dish. In general, I always tell people that, if your food is bland and it's not a dessert, it needs salt. And that doesn't mean you're adding a whole bunch of salt so it's salty. So like if you eat somebody's food and it's salty, it's because they added too much salt. Unless it's something like a sea salted caramel, fried chicken, something that you want that inherent salted quality to it. But if you go to a restaurant or you're at home and you're like, ooh, wow, this is very salty, it's just because it has too much sodium in it. If it's also still bland, and kind of speaking to Jeff's point, and you're like, ooh, well, I definitely don't want to put any more salt in this, then you can add a little bit of acid. And so acid is great when it comes to something like, wines that have some decent acidity to them, but also you could use lemon juice and things like that to really brighten up the dish. That being said, things that are really high in acid, like lemon juice or vinegar, you need like a couple drops, just a little sprinkle. If you're using something like, wine, it can be a splash. And so that will kind of, help to enhance the dish. But when you're cooking with wine, with some of these recipes that we'll continue to talk about, it's more about the flavor, bridging the flavor with the acid, and then also having the profile of the wine to enhance the dish with just the inherent qualities and flavor, and as you said, the fruit qualities that are inherent to that varietal and to that winemaking style.
So what is it about like Chardonnay and chicken that goes so well?
So, in the braised dish, so again, braising, for those of you who've just joined, is what people used to refer to as pot roasting. So I just want to kind of quickly talk about the methods and techniques you actually use when you're braising something. So I just want to point out a couple different types of cookware, just so you kind of are aware of some different types. And it's just so it's kind of a general overview of different things used for cooking. So a frying pan is this. It has sloped sides, and it generally doesn't have a top. Now, some of them do come with tops, but in general, frying pans don't necessitate a top because you're actually working on the stovetop with it, and you're not going to be, well, you can definitely finish it and transfer it in the oven, so you're having heat circulating from all around and not just from the bottom, but you're exposing it to the air in the oven. If you're doing something like a braised dish, you could use something like this, like a Dutch oven. Also, people would call this a soup pot. Stock pots are generally much taller, so you don't have as much evaporation. This is kind of, almost as, somewhat wide and deep, and it's pretty even. A saute pan is what a lot of people use for braising dishes, and it's straight sides. The loop on the top is so that you can grab it with a towel or a pot holder, and you can kind of balance the weight. It's much more important if you're using a 6-quart. This is a 3-quart. 4 quarts are the same, but they're a little bit taller. But they have a tightly fitting lid. So that's really important whether you're using this to braise or whether you're using something like this to braise. This is a enameled, this is a Le Creuset, which you don't have to have the expensive ones. But anything that is like an enamel line, so it's pretty much non-stick. It's also cast iron, so it's super, super heavy, and it allows you to go from stovetop to the oven really easily. And honestly, any pan will do, and this pot would do just as well because it's a tightly fitting lid. So in general, the rule of thumb is you have a recipe that you're preparing. Say it's the chicken. So you're going to add a fat to the dish, and this is so that you can actually brown the food. So browning is dehydration of the outside of the protein at a high enough temperature so that you develop the Maillard reaction, which is the browning that you get whether you sear something, and it has that umami flavor, which is like the fifth, kind of flavor that you want.
Wait, you got to go back. What was that reaction?
Maillard, and it's actually not spelled like that, but that's the way that it's
All right.
So the Maillard reaction is what you really want when you have a great quality flavor and what people kind of sometimes refer to as like a crust on a protein. It's actually the exact same flavor that you develop and you get from soy sauce and mushrooms. So those two things have that incredible flavor that's like if you have a perfect steak or even something you've browned perfectly as a protein, it's different than being caramelized. So caramelized is heating sugar to a point of caramelization, and it builds in color based on temperature. So as you color and caramel sugar, it goes from being clear to then a light kind of golden brown to then caramelized, and then it goes to red, and then it goes to black. And obviously the red is actually useful in some dishes, but the black is burnt. And that's when you put water in the pan and boil it for 10 minutes to release all the sugar off the bottom. If you ever tried to clean it in the sink, don't do that. Just put a lot of water in there and boil it, and that will release all the sugar. But if you're doing a protein and you sear it, what you're trying to do in the braised dish, you want to sear it on both sides to get color, but then you remove it from the pan. And so you have nice brown chicken, and then you're going to usually pour off some of or all of the fat and then add new fat because you degrade the fat as you actually heat it on the stove. So when you break down the fat, it kind of doesn't have the flavor that you'd want of that, fresh oil or whatever fat that you're using to cook in. And it's going to be in the sauce and in the dish at the end. So then at that point, you're taking whatever vegetables it is, your mirepoix vegetables, so it's like the backbone of flavor that's going to be in the dish. And it could be onions, carrots, leeks, celery, whatever the dish is composed of. And then you're going to soften those down a little bit. After you soften those down over heat, you're then going to be adding in wine. And then you want to reduce that until you only have the essence and the flavor of the wine, but really no more liquid. So it's really like you've just reduced it to a glaze. And you know that when you pull the vegetables across, that you have reduced out all of the alcohol and the water, and you only have the good stuff in there. At that point, you want to nestle your proteins back in there. And then you're going to be adding herbs or whatever other flavor ingredients are in the dish. And then you add a stock. And whether it's a vegetable stock, a fish fumet, which is a fish stock, beef stock, chicken stock, whatever it is that the dish calls for, you want to add it till it's about halfway up the side of the protein. So then you're going to, and this is also an important thing, you want to make sure you bring it to a boil on the stove before you put it in the oven to finish. The reason is it takes a lot more energy and a lot longer in the oven to actually bring that liquid to a boil to start it simmering than it does on the stovetop. So once you bring it to a boil, throw the lid on it and then put it in the oven. So you're going to cook it very gently in the oven, and if you were to look at the dish, it should be barely simmering. And so simmering is the bubbles are barely breaking the surface of the liquid. Boiling is very, very rapid, lots and lots of bubbles. And so when you do that, you're going to be kind of gently breaking down all the connective tissue in the braised dish. So most braised dishes come out being super tender and very, very flavorful because the proteins or whatever is you're braising, and we do a lot of braised dishes that are vegan, vegetarian, so it doesn't have to be a protein. But you're breaking down everything, whether it's the cellulose or the proteins, the connective tissues, until it's meltingly tender. And so you want to have something that when it comes out, you could really just kind of pull apart with a fork. And that's really what you're looking for. And so braised short ribs, braised chicken, all those should take on that quality.
So like when you're deciding like how long it takes for that braising process to occur, I mean, how many glasses of wine should you be consuming to kind of gauge that time period?
I mean, it depends on your intake, how hard your day's been, if you have any animals or kids that have no idea to the point where you need to have an extra one. It just
one
depends.
per kid, right?
I think that's probably the standard.
Yeah, that's about right.
Sheltering in place, that's the gold standard.
I think you get extra ones if your kids are under 5 as well.
Half a glass for a pet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think the time and so cooking is all about time and temperature, and so it depends on the temperature you're cooking at. Also depends on the type of thing you're cooking, and so this is going to be completely dependent on the type of protein, whatever it is you're cooking, to kind of get to the point where you're happy with the consistency. I would say the chicken is going to be more of like an hour dish. The short ribs are going to be like 2.5 to 3 hours, depending on the cut. And so you're looking to have them to the quality that you're looking for. If you ever heard the term fork tender is actually if you were to take just a regular fork, stab it in the protein, and if you were to lift it out, it stays behind and the fork comes out. If you can lift the protein out of the pan, then it's not done cooking yet. So that's one thing that kind of people use to gauge. But also if you were to take the fork and kind of like gently kind of move it, and also with the short ribs that contain bones, if those bones have started to pop out, then you know that the dish is done.
Very nice.
So if we're going to add, if we're deglazing a pan, so to speak, in general, how much wine should you use?
It depends on how much you want it to affect and dominate the flavor profile of the dish. So in deglazing, it depends on the recipe. The ones that I gave you are a little bit more foolproof, where you're not having to worry about drying your pan out to the point where you're going to burn it, or having to add wine to quickly cool down the pan. Because anytime you add something to a pan, you cool it down, especially liquid. It very quickly cools the pan down to, sometimes depending on the temp of the liquid, below boiling point. It has to come back, and also depends on your stove and the type of cookware you're using. But when you add something, you deglaze a pan, you want to make sure that you're adding enough to kind of just fill the bottom of the vessel, and you don't want it to be floating, because then the dish is going to taste like a lot of wine. But you also don't want it to be dry. You want it to be able to be enough that it goes across the bottom. Most of the recipes will give you a ratio of what's already been spelled out as the ingredient list, and it'll tell you, use a half a cup of wine, use a cup and a half, and that will dictate the portion for you.
So here's the thing, which I find fascinating, is that like Jeff asks the question, how much wine should I use? And to me, it was the easiest answer ever. It's what the recipe tells you, right?
Well, for those who don't read.
Well, so this is like the ongoing thing with Jeff and I, because it's a constant battle in the kitchen, because I am the one who cooks all the time. And so I am like all about the recipe. I'm a lawyer too. So everything is like, the recipe says you add this much at this point in time and everything like that.
Boring.
And then Jeff comes in, who is the chemist, and he's thinking about acidity and this and that and how, whatever you're doing in there. And all of a sudden something magical comes out of it, and you haven't followed any recipe at all. So it drives me nuts.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty classic thing though, right? I mean, there's a lot of people that just grew up cooking by learning from other people that didn't really have recipes. I think the classic example is, I have a really wonderful Indian woman named Neela who teaches classes from time to time. And she, grew up in India. She's had a lot of restaurants and cookbooks. And it took her forever to actually put a cookbook together, because nothing was done by measurement. It was all done by like, it needs a little bit of that. And, they do spice containers, all the dividers all the way around. And so there's, 50 spices in this one container. It's a little bit of that, a little bit of this. And it's just kind of done by knowing the nuance of the dish and what it needs. And I think, one suggestion I always make to everybody is, if you feel like your dish needs something and you're like, oh, I think it needs more salt, and maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, don't salt the whole dish. So like if you have a soup, you can take a little tiny portion of soup, a little bowl, and then add a minute amount of salt to it that would kind of reflect the ratio that would be in the pot if you were to do a big pinch, and then stir it in and then taste it. And that will allow you to kind of adjust your flavor on like a micro scale, as opposed to all of a sudden you've just bombed the whole dish with a whole bunch of salt, and then you've made it too salty for everybody. The same thing with acid, whether you're using wine, whether you're using vinegar, lemon juice, things like that.
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, is there such thing as using too much wine? I mean, can you really overdo it in that sense? But
yeah, you absolutely can, because then it's just going to taste like nothing but wine. And in some dishes, that's totally fine, because you want that to be the predominant ingredient. But you also, in a lot of other dishes, want it to carry flavor and to be present, but not to dominate and take over the dish. It just depends on the dish.
So we had one question come up that says, that asked about when doing your braising. So they want to know if you cook your, oh gosh, it went away. So you cook in the fat, you cook your celery, carrots, onions, or whatever, and then you add fat again.
So yeah, so it's usually you add fat, raise the temperature of the vessel, and then once your oil is hot, you add your protein. You will sear it, and this is just kind of just basic general methodology for braising. Then you're going to go ahead and brown it. Then you remove it, and then you pour off the fat because that fat has been used as a cooking medium, and it's broken down just by the process of heating it. But then you add a little bit of fresh oil or whatever fat you're cooking with, so that then that ingredient is going to be cooked over a lower temperature for a longer period of time, and so it will preserve the integrity of the fat you're cooking with. And so you're actually pouring it off, and then you're going to add a little bit more fresh oil. So then you cook your vegetables and other things in that, where it hasn't been broken down by the process of cooking over very high heat. And different fats have different smoke points. So if you're using something like butter and it's not clarified butter or ghee, it smokes it at a very low temperature and breaks down pretty quickly. If you have something like grapeseed oil, which is what we use in place of canola or vegetables, it's produced locally here, and it's a wonderful, what we call a neutral oil. So it has a nice richness to it, but not a specific flavor of its own. It just kind of has like a buttery quality the same way canola or vegetable would. It's the type of thing where you could use those interchangeably. It doesn't matter which one you use. And those have a very high smoke point of about 485 degrees. Olive oil, depending on the filtering and the process, breaks down at usually 350 to 375. So you can get your oil, if you're using grapeseed oil, much hotter, which allows you to brown things with more control without smoking your oil. In general, if your oil is in a pan and it's smoking, it's not a good thing. You don't want, when they say smoking hot, it's okay if you have like a little wisp of smoke on the outside of a pan, but if your whole pan is smoking, you've already started to actually degrade that. If you were to be in the Mediterranean, they think that smoking olive oil is very carcinogenic and is bad for you.
And that's probably the time that you'd want to open another bottle of wine.
Yeah, that's the time. Well, you just take the thing off the heat, dump out the oil, and then maybe you can wipe the pan out and then just add some more oil and start over. There's a lot of ways you can just kind of stop the process. And, this would go with the same thing of like, oh, the phone rang and I had to go get my cell phone, or something happens and you come back and your braising dish, all your vegetables are stuck to the bottom and have started to burn. What you don't want to do is you don't want to scrape all that stuff off, because then you're going to get all your burnt bits into your food, and that tastes horrible. You cannot get that kind of acrid burnt flavor out of your food. So what you would do is you would just take another pan, or if you don't have another pan, take a bowl, scrape the good stuff off there into the bowl or into a new pan, and then you could either rinse or wash out the existing pan, or in the new pan, you just heat it up with a little bit more oil and you just keep cooking. But you don't want to use burnt oil in your food, and you certainly don't want to use burnt food and actually scrape it up off the bottom of the pan into the dish.
So I just thought I'd chime in too right now. I threw out a poll out there so most people get to see the polls, not everyone does. But things that we asked was, when in doubt, I'll pair any meal with, and we gave them the options of Chardonnay, Cabernet, Zinfandel, Rosé, or beer. Thank goodness no one selected beer, but most people said Cabernet Sauvignon. And that's what they would prefer to pair things with. And I don't know, I'd say that's a pretty good standard to have. Hopefully it's Fontanella Cabernet Sauvignon. But anyways, since we're talking about reds, do you want to talk a little bit about cooking with red wine?
Sure, yeah. So the three recipes, it's a braised chicken dish, which there are a lot of chicken dishes that use red wine, but that one has white. And then the braised short rib uses a red. So you could use anything from, lighter style red, but either a Cabernet Sauvignon or a Zin are perfect ones to use for that. So if you are going to use those in a dish, they have a really wonderful way of lending themselves as a wine to drink with the dishes that you're cooking. It's one of those kind of stylistic choices, and we have a wine program here at the cooking school, and so I tell people you can drink any wine with any dish at any time. I am not here to like police you and tell you what I think is best, because there is no right answer. It's whatever you enjoy. And so, if I was going to be having, a halibut ceviche with a lot of, that's essentially a cooked, it's fish or seafood that's cooked in acid. I probably wouldn't do a big red, because to me, the flavor profile doesn't really mesh very well. But if you have kind of a little bit more of a lighter style dish, even if it is the braised chicken, you could totally have a cab with a braised chicken dish that uses a red wine to cook in. I think that it all depends on structure, tannins, acid, all the things that you're looking for in a dish. And if it's a well-balanced wine, it usually will pair better with more dishes, as opposed to a red that's really rough around the edges and either isn't ready to drink or is super flimsy and thin and has nothing but acid and has no structure. And I think that if you have a nice wine that has a nice finish that's balanced, from the first sip until the flavor drops off, you can usually pair that with more dishes. It just depends on the style and the quality of the wine.
Fantastic. Cool.
Yeah, I had one question going back one step on which fat to use when you are searing something. I mean, is there any general rule you'd say for using olive oil versus butter, let's say?
So I, in general, and this is just a blanket statement, if the fat is going to be in the dish in the end, then I make a very specific choice on which fat I use. So say I'm going to make a corn chowder or a summer corn soup or something. I love butter on my corn. So I'm probably going to use that as the building block of the dish, where I soften down my mirepoix, all the vegetables, that's the backbone of the flavor, in butter at the beginning at a lower temperature until they're meltingly tender. Because I'm not trying to brown anything. I'm just trying to get the flavors correct, and I'm trying to make sure I break down my onions and things so that I don't have that raw onion flavor, raw garlic flavor in the dish. At the same time, if I want to cook something in olive oil, it's usually an ingredient that I'm doing with purpose, because we use really expensive olive oil. And olive oil is an extremely precious ingredient, especially if you're using something super high in quality. So we use a couple different olive oils here. We use an Arbequina olive oil from the olive press, and also two of my cousins have Wild Poppies olive oil down in Aptos, where they make it from really specific vineyards and orchards. I'm sorry, orchards, not vineyards. And so, I want to make sure that I'm really, using that judiciously and making sure it's an ingredient that complements the dish, because it's an extremely, expensive and high quality ingredient. At the same time, our grapeseed oil producer is Salute Santé Grapeseed Oil here in Napa, and they also have really high quality stuff. But the cost ratio is just different. And so if I'm going to use a certain oil, I do it either for flavor profile, or I do it as a medium to cook in, and then I make the decision, is it an oil that's going to have a flavor that's going to be in the dish, or is it just a cooking medium that I'm going to discard afterwards? And one thing that people don't usually understand as home cooks is that the amount of fat that you use to brown or cook a protein in a dish is almost 100% of that is going to be it's either going to be aerosolized and lost as part of the cooking process, or it's going to be residual in the pan. And if you don't add enough fat to a pan, you're going to burn your food. And so people are like, oh, I only want to put 1 tablespoon of olive oil in there, or grapeseed oil, because I don't want to either have too much fat in my food, or yes, obviously you don't want to waste it. But at the same time, if your pan is dry, you're going to burn your food. And it's just a medium to conduct the heat from the bottom of the pan into the protein. And so in general, we use, for high heat sauteing and cooking, we use grapeseed oil, and you could again use canola or vegetable instead. But if we're going to have something in a dish, sometimes we make the decision to use a different cooking medium in order to have the flavor of that in the dish.
So we had someone asking in particular with bacon fat, like if you have leftover bacon fat, if it's something that you can use in other recipes. For example, she was asking about her cornbread. Like if you had cooked something in bacon fat, do you recommend that?
Sounds good.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think as long as you really haven't burned the bits of the bacon that's in the pan. So if you look at the bottom of the pan, you don't see any scorched areas where it's kind of black and looks like you burn the pan, which obviously then your bacon would be burned most of the time. Then absolutely. And we actually have a pretty fun cornbread recipe that is one that uses, some corn flour, and then, which is just ground corn. And then also uses fresh corn kernels at the end, and then it's baked. And in that, you fold in a pretty generous amount of, bacon fat. So it's a good ingredient to cook with. But it does burn at a much lower temperature than other oils that you usually will cook with, because it's not refined and it's not filtered.
So we have some questions that are going to get to dessert, but do you want to talk a little bit about cooking with red wine? I know you got a recipe with the red wine, and then maybe we'll move into a dessert conversation at the end.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so the braised short rib recipe, again, you can use kind of a heavier medium to, full-bodied wine. There's other ones that you would be using, say like Pinot Noir or something, whether you're doing it with duck or something that may be a little bit, kind of lighter in profile. When you're doing a lot of cooking with red wine, it's something that I tend to be a little bit more judicious with how much wine I use, just because the reduced quality of that wine, just like the fuller bodied wines being, reds, are going to be a little bit more bold when they're actually still in a sauce or what you're cooking. So I tend to use less, red wine than I would ratio wise to a white wine. But that's not always the case. It's kind of subjective to what you're cooking and also what you're cooking with. There are a lot of recipes where, like the dessert recipe, uses your rosé. So it's macerating, and it's not cooking at all. It's just, putting a rosé into a bowl with berries and allowing that acid and alcohol to break down the berries a little bit and kind of soften them. And so then you're using, you're whipping up a mascarpone, cheese, a little bit of heavy cream, and that's also used as a topping. So you have the richness of the cream, you have the acid of the wine, and then also the sugar and the qualities of the berries. And, with everything, I use recipes as my guide and something that's not an absolute, because if, we use everything seasonally here, if we're very lucky in California, and also lucky to have a farm, that everything we're using is of that day. And so we're not, using tomatoes or berries in February that aren't grown here. So we just kind of use those ingredients as they come in and out of season. Sometimes you don't need to add as much of an ingredient to a recipe, and it's all about, the ratios, because maybe your berries have more sweetness and maybe they don't. It just depends on the year and also the time and also the season.
Do you ever cook with grapes?
We do actually have some recipes that use grapes. You can put them into sauces. It's a little bit more difficult to cook with grapes that are not seedless, just because you're crunching on seeds. And also the tannin structure that comes from the extraction when you're mashing up grapes or anything of those grapes. Jeff can talk to you about this in winemaking. But it tends, if you're chewing on a grape that has a whole bunch of seeds in it, it's usually not a very pleasant flavor to be in the dish. But you can use them fresh in salads. You can have them as kind of a finishing ingredient if you make a sauce. And then we definitely do have some recipes where you can cook with grapes, and also we cook with raisins a lot. That's actually a really nice way to use another form of a ingredient that's been dried.
So just for everyone out there, for your edification, like our plan is that the recipes that Malcom's referring to during this webinar, we're going to get copies of them to you if you guys request them. So we don't necessarily have everybody's emails. If you're in the wine club or on Malcom's mailing list, then we'll be able to send those out to you. But if you have special requests at the end, I'll let you guys know who to email in order to get a copy of these recipes, because these are all great recipes and you're getting some great tidbits about how to be cooking them and what to be thinking about in the process. So I just wanted to interject that. So in terms of the rosé, since you kind of started down that a little bit, do you want to talk a little bit more about that recipe in particular, or do you feel like?
Yeah, I mean, you can use a lighter bodied red. I always think about cooking with wine as being something that just the natural structure and winemaking qualities of that wine is not going to, again, take over and dominate that dish. So, you could use a little bit of Zin, or you could use a little bit of Cab. It also just depends on the berries. If you're using something like a raspberry, like a golden raspberry, as opposed to something like a really hardy, very ripe, blackberry or boysenberry or something of that nature, they can hold up to different types of wine. You don't really see a lot of rosé in dishes, and I don't know, necessarily why that is, because, maybe people think of rosé is either being a byproduct of a winemaking process, or they think of rosé as just something that for a long time was just a really badly made wine. I mean, I love rosés. I mean, I'll drink rosé in the summer. It's a great hot weather wine, but it's also great just it's a good wine pairing. So I think it's probably because it got a bad rap, especially in this country for a long time, because of the quality of the rosé was just terrible.
Well, I think this is a good opportunity for Jeff to maybe talk a little bit about how you make rosé and maybe understand why it's a wine to be appreciated. Is that something you could talk about?
Yeah, sure. So when we're making rosé, we're actually bleeding. It's a bleed off or a Sieyes from a tank of wine. It was kind of born of an effort to concentrate the tank of wine. So we were kind of draining off some of the early juice so that what was left in that tank of Cabernet, for example, would become more concentrated and powerful as a Cabernet. But that bleed off has this nice rosé color. It has just the faintest hint of tannin structure. It still has really good acidity and expresses these nice citrus notes. And so we started the rosé program a few years ago off of some of our Sieyes tanks. And so while it's not the really traditional form of rosé, we think it has a little more body than maybe the really lean minerally styles, and it's got still a really expressive fruit component. So we think it goes pretty well as a California style rosé. And we'd use a combination of Cabernet Sauvignon and Zinfandel to craft this rosé. Yeah, so all stainless too. So no barrels. There's no barrel influence. These wines are bottled fairly young and meant to be consumed young. These aren't wines that necessarily you'd want to age and lay down in your cellar for a number of years, but their wines are really destined to be released in spring, and with the new seasons and the good weather, and the general rule in our house is if the sun's out, you can drink rosé. So they're really I think able to be enjoyed in a lot of fronts with a lot of different foods, and definitely in a lot of different environments.
So I think the other thing, Jeff and I, kind of reminds me, as we're talking a little bit about different wines, is right before we started this, Jeff was like, hey, I'm going to open up a bottle, and cracked open a bottle of our 2013 Zinfandel.
Well, it wasn't just on a whim. We've had a few questions and people writing in over the other webinars. When should I open this Zin? How long should I lay down Zin? And for some reason, Zin in particular. So we kind of dug into the cellar and thought, well, let's check in on some Zin. It's not necessarily a wine that people think of laying down for a long time. But when we're making our Zin, we're trying to make a balanced wine. So in theory, if it's balanced when we're putting the cork in the bottle, it's got a really good chance of aging well. And that means balance in terms of tannin extraction, acidity, and fruit component. So you've got to have a decent amount of fruit there and acidity for any wine to age well. It's not just a one-way street on tannin extraction. Something that's overly extracted and tannic, that's probably not going to age well. So our Zin, so we went in and we kind of thought, hey, maybe we do a little cellar report. We grabbed a 2013 Zin out of the cellar, and it is really showing just very, very nicely. If you can see right here, I have in my glass, the color has held up extremely well. The fruit is still just really pronounced, but it's, instead of being very bright and so, I guess 13 was a very powerful vintage. Instead of being really bright and upfront, the fruit has kind of softened, and the layers of this wine, the complexity of this wine has really opened up a lot of the barrel nuance and the sweetness. Some of these vanilla and kind of chocolatey characters out of the barrel are really showing very nicely in this wine. So for those of you who've maybe have a few vintages of Zinfandel in your cellar, 7 years out, these wines are singing. So if you've got a 13, I would open it. It is hitting a really, really nice spot. But I think 14, 12s, I think anywhere in that neighborhood, you're going to be really happy opening one of those older vintages of Zinfandel right now.
I was blown away when Jeff opened it up and poured it for me. I had no idea what he was pouring. It knocked my socks off. So I would certainly try it out if you guys have some older vintages. But in regards to that, Malcolm, like, let's talk a little bit about cooking. Well, we can talk a little about cooking with Zinfandel, but in particular, like, is there a difference between an aged wine versus a younger wine when you're cooking at all? Or is it just, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on obviously how well it's aged. So if you have a Zin, that's held up really well, it probably has the same nuances and qualities in the dish that a younger one would have. But sometimes wines obviously change every single day. And that's the great thing about wine, is that, no bottle is the same from one day to the next. They're always changing, always evolving. And so as long as it hasn't gone over the hill, so that's another, quality where you don't want to have a wine that really has exceeded its ability to lay down and be aged, and it just starts to fall apart. The structure is not there anymore. You don't want to put that in your food. You also don't want to cook, again, with a poor quality wine, and you don't want to cook with something that's corked. That's like the worst thing ever, because you concentrate that flavor of corked wine into your dish. And so that kind of like wet, moldy cardboard from the basement, that flavor you get from a corked bottle of wine, that will be really, really pronounced and really bad in the dish. So obviously you don't want to cook with a poor quality or a flawed wine. But I think, in general, it depends on obviously the price point too. A lot of the wines I lay down for a while, I'm probably going to reserve that for something that's at the table a little bit more, because if it's something that's a newer vintage and I can buy more of, that might be something I can use a little bit more in the pan and a little bit less at the table. But the ones that I've aged for a while, I probably don't want to be using those as judiciously as I would something that's a current release. And so, as long as, again, the wine has held up to aging well, I don't think there's a whole lot of difference in the flavor profile, because you're going to be reducing it in most dishes and just down to the essence of the wine.
And so in terms of the recipe that you have for the braised short ribs, could you use Zinfandel or Cabernet, or do you have a recommendation between the two? What would be better?
I think either is a great choice. I mean, they both have wonderful qualities to both wines. I would say that most people probably have more Cab than Zin, unless you're a big Zin person. And so, whatever you have more of, laying around might be something you gravitate towards, where it might be your personal preference. But I think, either of those are good choices. And so it doesn't really matter which one you use, as long as you enjoy the flavor and the quality of the wine. Both of those are going to work equally as well in the dish.
So just to kind of interject, one of the polling questions that I just sent out a little bit ago, I don't know if you saw it, Malcolm, but anyway, so the question I just sent out was how Jeff and Malcolm met, because that's how we are connected with Jeff and Malcolm. And so the question—
Sorry, Malcolm.
This is all, I apologize. But here are the potential answers: was at an industry wine tasting event, working at In-N-Out when they were in high school, on the golf course, or when they tied at the finish line at a triathlon in Santa Cruz. And so the winner was that they met when they were working at In-N-Out high school.
Oh, they got it.
No, which is not true.
Poor Malcolm. He was only like 5 years old when I was in high school.
That's not true either.
Yeah. Well, Malcolm's actually from the East Coast, so Malcolm didn't even have In-N-Outs where he was at. So how old were you when you got introduced to In-N-Out?
When I moved to California, that was now a little more than 10 years ago.
Okay, so, and do you like In-N-Out?
I do. I mean, being somebody that's kind of like a small farm, Napa person that really enjoys kind of the smaller producers of wine and also food, I tend to, gravitate towards the smaller mom and pop shops in town. But I mean, if I go by an In-N-Out and people want to have it, I absolutely go.
So where they actually met was where? You guys tell us.
Golf.
Golfing. Yeah, it must have been.
So they're both golfers. But the triathlon thing's not too far off. Well, for half. It's 50% off. So Malcolm actually does triathlons. And right, is that correct, Malcolm?
I used to do a lot of them, and now I'm going to try to do like one small race a year, but I haven't done one in the past year or so.
And Jeff, how many have you done?
Triathlons? I do Chard, Rosé, and Reds Every day.
A different kind of triathlon.
Oh,
so.
what are you talking about?
So anyways, I thought it was funny if you guys would be interested in how we kind of all got together. So, so in terms of any last thoughts on cooking with wine, we have a few more minutes here, but I know one of the questions someone had, and I think this is a good time to talk about it, is in particular cooking with white wines. We had a particular question about port, because we actually do make a port style wine, but in terms of cooking with a port, any thoughts on what that looks like? And obviously drinking with port's great. But.
Yeah, I mean, port for me is something that's used a lot in dessert recipes. It pairs really well with chocolate and with berries and other things like that. But you also will see it in other dishes where you want a sweet quality to a dish. And so, if you had something where you wanted to have, your beef recipe is going to have some type of actually, let's use another example, duck. If you wanted to have something that has a sweet quality to it. So we do, Liberty Farms is produced over in Sonoma, spectacular duck. You can order it from anywhere in the country. I think probably the best quality duck that I've ever had. When we do recipes where we're making either, say a reduction sauce for like a duck confit, or we're doing, seared duck breast to serve medium rare, that would lend itself more to a sweeter type sauce. And a lot of those we will use, say either a Pinot or a Merlot or, a lighter style cab. We will use that, but you could also supplement a little bit of port in there, because not only can you then immediately actually ignite the alcohol in there and cook out all the alcohol immediately. But then you might use something like, say cherries, or either a fresh cherry or cherry preserve, and that's going to have a fair amount of sugar in it as well. And that type of sauce tends to go very, very well as long as it has acid. And so, the acid in the wine, even though it's very sweet, you can pick up a lot more once you start to concentrate it and also cook out the alcohol. And so, that would be something you could definitely include in a savory recipe, as well as including in something that's sweet as well.
That sounds great.
Now we've mentioned we've mentioned port a few times. We make a wine that's a fortified wine, and just so everyone understands, it's a Zinfandel wine. Basically what happens is we're fermenting it about halfway through, and we pull off the wine and add brandy about halfway. That addition of brandy raises the alcohol level to around 17% for us, and it stops the yeast. They can't survive over a certain level of alcohol, so it arrests the fermentation. So we make a wine called Portmanteaux, and it's a fortified dessert wine that's made out of Zinfandel grape. Basically, everything's really similar to a traditional red fermentation. We crush, we ferment on the skins. It's just that fermentation is shorter, and we arrest the fermentation with brandy, and we oak age it, and it becomes a port style fortified wine.
And it's delicious.
Yeah, very good dessert wine. We really like it. We tend to be a little lower in alcohol than traditional port, and a little lower in residual sugar. We just feel like it lets the fruit characteristics sing a little bit more and be the showcase.
All right, so I have a question for you, because one of the things that I find really interesting is Jeff loves setting food on fire. So any chance he has to get something on the stove and light it on fire,
he's gonna sell the sizzle.
Sure.
So any thoughts on what he should be doing as opposed to what he's actually doing?
It's a very quick way to cook the alcohol out of the wine, as I said before. Also, as I get, a lot of California wines and wines produced in the United States, depending on the wine growing climate, tend to have a little bit more alcohol in them than old world wines, where they don't have the climate to ripen grapes as well and as easily. This is kind of the perfect place to grow really any fruit, and that's also, wine grapes as well. You can have some wines that are very, very high in alcohol that are not fortified, like the port style wine that you make. If you do add it to a pan, you can ignite that pan, and if people are not really ready for it, it will really just catch fire and go. I've done that with a couple pretty high alcohol wines. But in general, the alcohol burns at a much lower temperature than, say, a piece of paper or something else that burns at a much higher temperature. And so, it's kind of startling, but you can actually, get relatively close to it, or actually kind of put your hands in it, which I don't advise if you're not somebody that cooks, professionally or very, very well. That's very good at kind of gauging heat and temperature just with your proximity to it. But it's something where it's very exciting to do. And the two things that people do all the time on cooking videos and on cooking shows is they either flambe or ignite a pan, or they're cutting really, really fast where their knife is slamming down into the counter. Those two things, they sound great, they look great. Is it necessary in a dish? No. I mean, it's not something you do very often when you're cooking with.
The kids love it. Yeah, my status goes up when.
Well, any more we're going to look towards wrapping up now. Any kind of final thoughts, Malcolm? We so appreciate you being here, and any tidbits to send everyone off on?
Yeah, would you tell us, so anybody that joined from either our Facebook page or any of our mailing lists, would you let them know your website for Wine Club and how they can find your wines?
Yes, we will let everyone know. I think most importantly, Jeff and I really want to sincerely thank you, Malcolm, for taking your time to join us and share your knowledge base about the wines. I think once we put this out on all the different platforms, everyone was kind of like, we want recipes, we want to cook with you. And so at some point, we'd love to convince you to come on do a demonstration if you'd be willing. And it seems like my little polling, people would like to see you actually cooking in the kitchen.
I'm happy to do a recipe, and I can do it in a way that you can garner ingredients pretty easily. So even if you are shelter in place or not, depending on your locality, then you can definitely do that, pretty comfortably. I love the two of you dearly, and I'm happy to be here to do it. And then also, it seemed in the poll that Jeff and I can do, some cooking together. And so as long as when we're allowed to do that, then we'll execute that as well.
Let's hope that we're all going to be released here a little sooner, because it's a good reason for us to be released. So a couple things for all of you out there to know. So grab a pen and paper if you guys have one near. Everyone who's listening, because I have some information for all of you to share, and you're going to want to write this down because I don't have any other way to get it to you. First, if you want the recipes from today's webinar, we can send them out to you. Those of you who belong to the Wine Club, will send it out to the Wine Club in general and let everyone know. But for those of you who don't have our contact information, you can either go on our website, which is fontanellawinery.com. That's FONTANELLAWINERY.com. And you can also email us at info at fontanellawines, so FONTANELLAWINES.com. So that's how you can get the recipes. Also, you can, purchase wines, join our wine club, do anything that you want by going to our website. You can read all about Jeff and Karen, that's us, on the website. Also, and most importantly, is Silverado Cooking School. Obviously, you need to be in Napa to go to the Silverado Cooking School, but what you can do now is visit their website. You can purchase gift certificates. And when you're planning your trip to Napa, because we will be open again, and we're going to want all of you to come back to Napa. So what you need to do is book a tasting at Fontanella, and then you need to go to Silverado Cooking School and learn to cook with Malcolm and his amazing staff. And you can find information about them if you go to their website, which is silveradoCookingSchool.com. It's super easy. I don't think I need to spell it, but just silveradoCookingSchool.com. And so, like I said, you can buy gift certificates now, which is great. And I think as soon as we're open, then you'll be able to look at potentially signing up for their classes. But right now, we're still kind of in limbo in California, so we don't know yet. And hopefully we'll have a chance to get Chef Malcom back with us and get Jeff and Malcolm cooking in the kitchen together. And in which case, if we do that, what we'll do is we'll send out a recipe ahead of time, some wine pairings, get you guys all set up ahead of time so you guys can cook along with them when we do that as a webinar. In terms of Fontanella, I have a couple things to tell you guys about. For those of you who are new to Fontanella, we have a great offer right now on shipping. Right now we have $1 shipping. So if you buy 3 or more bottles, you can purchase online and use the promo code STOCKUP, STOCKUP. So STOCKUP is the promo code that you would use, and you get $1 shipping on any 3 bottles or more shipped out to you. We have a great tasting kit if you've never tried Fontanella wines, where you can kind of taste through our lineup and learn about a little bit about who we are in our wines as well. So the tasting kit, but stockup.com is the promo. And then for a lot of you out there are wine club members, one of the biggest challenges about not having our tasting room open is that we don't have new people coming and being introduced to our wine. That's one of the most wonderful things about having a tasting room here on site on our property where we're at. And so what happens is people come and they taste our wines and they join our wine club and become part of our family, like many of you have. And so not having people signing up for a wine club is one of the saddest things for us. And so what we want to offer to our wine club members is that if you have friends and family that you would like to introduce to our wine club, then for every referral that you give, Hobie will add an additional bottle of wine into your next wine club shipment. So any one of our regular lineup of wines that you get in your wine club ship, you'll be able to add a bottle for every referral that you make. And if you decide that, hey, I'm at home and I'm drinking a lot of Fontanella, I want to bump up and get more bottles in each shipment, for any upgrade that you make to your own wine club, we will throw in an extra bottle of your choosing into your next wine club shipment. So those are some special things for you guys to all know about. And finally, next week, we have a really exciting tasting that we've been talking about. We're going to be tasting 2 of Jeff's favorite vintages that he's ever made. That's our 2008 Cabernet and our 2016 Cabernet. He's going to taste them side by side. And that's going to be next Friday at 4:30. If you are interested in joining us and you have not gotten the email, you can go to that info@fontanellawines.com and we will tell you, we will give you all the login information that you need to know about that. And if you haven't bought your wines yet, because we have a package that's out there, you can still, if you're on the West Coast, you can still purchase probably and get it shipped to you in time. And that's what our package is. It's 1 bottle of the 08 and 1 bottle of the 16. If you're on the East Coast, I probably can't get it to you on time, but you can still order it, join us for the webinar, and drink the wines afterwards. So that's a mouthful, and I'm sorry, but we got it all. Malcolm, thank you again.
Thank you, Malcolm. Thanks, buddy.
Thank you, guys.
It was great having you. And for all of you out there, thank you for joining us. Please join us next Friday at 4:30. We're looking forward to it. And get your Cabernet palettes ready. And Jeff's going to go all geeked out on.
And check out Silverado Cooking School.
And check out Silverado Cooking School. So thank you all. Have a good night. Enjoy.
Thank you, guys. Take care.